Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. We try every week to bring you a scintillating show, and this week is no exception. We've had some excellent speakers in the last few months, and tonight is no exception. Andrea Pisauro from Europe for Scotland will be with us tonight shortly. But I want to do as I do each night, every show, is to talk about why this has been such a great day for British democracy. Tonight, it's sort of hard to begin because I'm so spoiled for choice, I have to say. I learned tonight, for example, that our esteemed Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is returning. According to the prince, it says he's returning 6,000 of gifts. 6,000. He's had considerably more, of course, but he's returning 6,000. I don't know why. I don't think he's quite got around to telling us this, but it would be enlightening to know why he's planning to return them now and why he didn't refuse them in the first place or return them as soon as people became concerned. He obviously works to he uses a different moral compass, I suspect, that compared to many of us. So the question is, why is he returning them? If they were okay last week or yesterday, why do they have to be returned today? The other question is, if it's not wrong, i.e., if there was no problem with the gifts, as you told us last week, you told us, and your minions repeated it ad nauseum. They told us that it was simply a question of declaration, i.e., there's nothing wrong with the gifts as long as you declare them, which is a very odd way of thinking about public ethics. And who is he repaying? I mean, which gifts is he repaying? How did he decide which gifts to repay and which not? Was it based on magnitude, i.e. the size of the gift? Because we all know, as a result of this morning's news, that his party took millions from the betting industry. Now, he's not returning millions, he's only returning 6K. So we don't know what judgment he brought to bear in calculating to return the 6K. The other question that arises is, what is happening about the other gifts? And a reasonable question that we could all ask is there any conceivable connection between this unexpected burst of public ethics and the fact that his benefactor, Lord Ali, is being reported to the House of Lords committee because he didn't declare his interests in a tax haven. These are the institutions which the EU took grave exception to, but the British government was reluctant to dispense with. Brexit, of course, put an end to all that controversy because the UK can now carry on regardless and keep all of its tax havens in the Caribbean and elsewhere. And other news tonight, just in case you're of the opinion that this is just awful stuff, and it's just, on a more light-hearted note, I gather that one of the King's horses has been awarded the OBE. And many of you, I think, will be thinking, not before time. It's high time that horses were ennobled. I mean, after all, you can't have the King's horses and all the King's men getting gongs and not the King's horses. That would be ludicrous. All we need now, by the way, is Humpty Dumpty, and we've got the full set. So, without any further ado, let me introduce tonight's guest. We are joined by Andrea Pisauro, who we've talked with before, but we've got some really exciting stuff to talk about tonight. Welcome, Andrea. How are you?
Thank you, John. I'm good, thank you, and very nice to see you again and to be part of the TNT show.
It's a great pleasure. I know you've got some views because we chatted earlier about the last election in the UK. Now, you're more familiar with a less of a first past the post system and more of a proportional system that exists in Italy. So tell us what your views are, what your reaction is to the last UK general election. What do you think of it?
Yeah, thank you for the question, John. I mean, I've been now in the UK for enough time to remember a few general elections because I arrived, I think, just before the 2010 general election, which was, of course, the beginning of the Tory rule in the country. So basically, I had a Tory government for my entire life in the country. That's the first Labour government. Yeah, when we discussed within Europe for Scotland what to think about this general election, there were a number of things that immediately we found quite starking and incredible to an extent. You might, everyone knew that the Tories were going to lose, but then it was the lowest results in their history, and their history is 4 centuries long. So the significance and the historic nature of the election was clear to everyone. And that was the first thing to comment on, if you want, at the end of the Tory rule. And, you must trust me when I tell you that everyone in Europe was relieved. Everyone in Europe was happy because they have seen it all: Brexit, COVID, Boris Johnson, the scandals, Liz Truss, so you name it. So obviously everyone realized immediately the end of the Tory rule is good for the UK, for Scotland, for England, for Wales, for Northern Ireland, for Europe. But at the same time, it was also an historic election from a different perspective because, yes, the Labour Party won an overwhelming majority of seats, but it did so with the lowest share of votes of any party winning government in UK history. So since the introduction of universal suffrage, all parties that have won government had more votes than Labour did this time. So this is the weakest democratic legitimacy that any government has ever had. And not just that, because Labour got a very low share of votes. If you don't trust the percentage, you can look at the number of votes, which was poor, was 9.7 million votes. This was less than what Tony Blair had, but also what Jeremy Corbyn had, both in 2017 and in 2019. And of course, this was on the backdrop of the lowest turnout in history. If you look at the numbers and correct for the people registered to vote, just 52% of people who had the right to vote turn out to vote. So clearly, from a democratic perspective, it was a very dysfunctional this situation in which the party that wins with so few votes, with such a low percentage, and yet with such an enormous amount of seats. So this discrepancy between the weakness of the electoral mandate and the strength of the electoral representation is quite starking from a European perspective, because we need to always remember that it's not just Italy, but most of Europe has proportional representation or mixed system like the one that Scotland has, and only the UK has this anti-democratic, from my perspective, first past the post, in which you can get a seat just because your opponent are divided, but without a large number of votes. And on top of that, I think there is an even starker fact that the new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, he won his seat, obviously, because otherwise he wouldn't be in Parliament. But in his own seat, he saw his level of support halved compared to 5 years ago. And this is also completely unprecedented. Usually what happens in UK general election is that the guy who is about to become Prime Minister sees an increase of votes in his own constituency. And this is down to the prestige of the role, to the fact that people expect that person to get to power. And this was true for all Labour and Tory prime minister of the past, and it's a constant because it's a strong mandate to the guy that is about to. And in the case of Keir Starmer, just the opposite happened. he lost 16% of his own vote. And this speaks to me to part of the dysfunctionality of this election, in which there wasn't a clear enthusiasm for the government, there wasn't any enthusiasm for the prime minister. And we saw that in the following weeks, because that, even people that voted for Keir Starmer were suddenly realizing that something was not working in the government. It was a mistake after mistake, poor communication, poor political choices. I can't even list them all, because in 3 months, you don't remember a good positive vibe coming from down the street. And this is a few of the elements that we highlighted as the dysfunctionality of this UK general election.
One of the thoughts. Well, let me come on to one of the thoughts in a second. But some people listening and watching might be thinking, well, hold on a second here. It's all very well to criticise the British general election, and they may agree with much, if not all, of what you've just said. But look at Italy. It's got a far-right government. Surely it's better to have a stumbler and like Starmer than somebody like Meloni in Italy. What would you say to that?
Well, I would definitely agree that it's better to have Starmer than Meloni. I was in agreement with myself until a week ago, but then what happened was that Keir Starmer went to Rome, met Giorgia Meloni, and praised her for her immigration policy. And there I was completely flabbergasted, because, I am Italian. I think I am an anti-fascist. Giorgia Meloni comes from the worst possible political tradition. And here he goes with a Labour prime minister just elected, that, by the way, the only good thing I think he did in the last few months was to abolish the Rwanda deal that the Tories had brought about to deport immigrants and asylum seekers to Rwanda. And then he goes to Rome, embraces, literally, they were smiling and hugging each other, Giorgia Meloni, and praise her for her immigration policy, which is this Albania deal, which is not that different from the Rwanda deal. It's still about deporting migrants to a third country where their rights are not necessarily respected, and just, to use this country as a repository of human beings, because you want to send a message to the electorate or whatever. It's all it's wrong. It's wrong from the perspective of any progressive person. And the fact that Keir Starmer goes there to praise Giorgia Meloni was also, let me put it this way, a problem for the Italian comrades that are in the same socialist party of Starmer, because they are opposing Giorgia Meloni on that same deal. They criticize the Albania deal, and then Keir Starmer arrives and says, "Oh yeah, I mean, Giorgia Meloni is doing fine with immigration." So he created a mess, not just in the UK, but also in Italy. With that day, the news were all over the place. So I'm sorry to say, is he anti-fascist? Is he a progressive person? Sometimes you wonder.
Well, I mean, I suppose his apologists would say, yeah, but he's the head of government in the UK. Why shouldn't he meet with the head of government in Italy? If the Italian people elected a fascist, that's their prerogative.
On that, I can agree. I can agree that they should meet. The point is what they say when they do, and the level of warmth and the level of narrative and the sound bites that comes out of the meeting. And because, after that meeting, you wonder who the hell is Keir Starmer? What does he think about any issue? If he can flip-flop, go from one extreme to the next in the space of such a short amount of time.
Yeah, I mean, I have to agree. I find it confusing. Normally, when you look at senior political figures, you can sort of get a sense of where they're coming from ethically and morally. You look at them and you say, hold on a second, this person is coming from the right, and their moral position is predicated upon that. It's harder to do that with Starmer. He seems to be, he's very hard to pin down. I mean, if you listen to any of the things he said before he was elected, he has since overturned all of those. He said they would never victimize pensioners, and he's gone ahead and done it. He said they would never victimize students, and they plan to do that. But more importantly than any of that, and we can come back to talking about some of these if you like, he also said that there would be no austerity. And all of his MPs and MSPs echoed the same line. There will be no austerity. And I do remember during the election, various SNP candidates said, but there's a huge black hole. To which his response was, even if there is, our programs are fully costed. Now he's telling us, A, the black hole is a huge surprise, and B, nothing is costed. Usually, there's a terrible political price to pay for misleading the voters.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't come short in terms of disappointments because, as you pointed out, and I must say, I was a Labour member when Keir Starmer was elected. I, threw my membership apart a few months later. He was elected on a progressive platform with the commitment to keep the policies of Jeremy Corbyn and with the commitment to unite the party. And in a few months, you see those policies thrown away in the bin and never repeated again. And Keir Starmer is kicking out of the party Corbyn and somehow the other MPs in the left. And, it's not just a problem for the left, it's a problem for democracy when a leader makes it more easy to, challenge the leadership. He passed a number of reforms in the Labour Party to make it more difficult for the party to challenge the leadership. He completely messed up the candidacy. There were a number of constituencies in England where the candidate was changed just because he was not aligned with the leadership. These are things that people in the Labour Party know, but perhaps the general public hasn't followed them as thoroughly. Yeah. But then with Starmer, I feel sometimes you have, from one side, because I don't want to exaggerate, obviously there are some things that I agree with in the program that the government wants to put forward with the nationalization of the railway and other things. But there is always a lack of imagination. It's always not very ambitious. It's always very so mild that at some point you don't know what's the reform on one side. And on another side, there is this tendency that Sam seems to have that is what his biographer Oliver Eagleton wrote on the New York Times, that Starmer seems to have a deeply authoritarian impulse. He's always acting on behalf of the powerful. So this is Oliver Eagleton is a guy that follows Starmer over his career as prosecutor, so before he entered into politics. And his assessment was, he's always going to stand up for those in power. And that's clearly not the most appealing trait for a progressive or a democratic leader. And, this lack of imagination from one side and authoritarian impulse from the other side makes it.
I mean, I agree. There's a lot of, he does seem to vacillate and change his mind a lot. And you could be generous and say he didn't set out to mislead. Events overtook him, and therefore he was forced to change his mind. That's being kind. Most people listening to him would come to a different view, but let's be kind and say events overtook him. He didn't understand what he was saying, wasn't accurate, but now he's in power and he's seen the books. He has now decided that he has to reverse all of the policies that he once espoused. I think that is one thing, but you've highlighted something else, which is that it gives the impression of bearing the impression of the last person who sat on him, as they used to say about some politicians, i.e. that he's made of plasticine, he's plastic, and he tends to respond to the last phone call he's had, where somebody has blasted in his ear and said, you really have to think very seriously about this, and it gets done. I mean, for example, take their economic policy, which is just shot through with nonsense. I mean, I see senior Labour MPs saying the same things that Thatcher said that have now been discredited, i.e. that a country's economy is exactly like a household. and you have to tax people in order to find money to spend. That was wrong then, and it's wrong now. And it's been discredited by thousands of economists, and yet they're persisting in this nonsense. Why do you think that is the case, Andrea?
Well, because they don't have a sense that telling the truth is the right way to approach politics, it seems, sometimes. They have this sense that they need to appeal to some voter somewhere that is very moderate, very, has some degree of weird common sense that they seem to try to appeal all the time. But they don't try to explain what are the issues, and they're not honest. They're not honest with the public. And there is one thing that we didn't even mention, but as a European, comes as a huge betrayal from Starmer, and this is obviously Brexit. I mean, Starmer won the leadership contest of the Labour Party partly because he was talked about as the most pro-European candidate at the time, and obviously he had studied the dossier. He was the Brexit shadow minister, so he knows the situation. Did he change anything there? Nothing whatsoever. Keir Starmer red lines on Brexit are the same as Theresa May. Is refusing to contemplate any sort of deal with the EU, from Erasmus to a mobility scheme that the UK has with New Zealand and Australia. So it's really not comprehensible why he cannot have it with the EU. And he even said, I think, a couple of days before the general election, that he doesn't want the UK to rejoin the EU ever, for his whole lifetime.
That's right.
And that's to me it's an utter betrayal of what we knew he was thinking just a few years ago.
Yeah, it's crazy. Question that we've had is it's specifically about Europe for Scotland, and the questioner Mike is asking, Europe for Scotland had plans to lobby the European Parliament. Has that happened? And if it has, what reactions were there?
Yes. So during you know that in last June, so a month before the UK general election, there were also elections across the European Union for the renewal of the European Parliament. And Europe for Scotland ran a campaign to ask prospective candidates to become MEP if they were willing to express their solidarity with Scotland and their commitment to help an application from an independent Scotland to rejoin the EU to be processed quickly and swiftly in the European Parliament. And we got a few dozens MEPs from a few most European countries that signed this commitment, and 10 of them were elected in the European Parliament. And this was we did this in a complicated political time. I don't need to tell that to you and your audience, but obviously it was when people could see that there was a change of government expected to happen in Britain, and after there was the crisis of the Scottish government as well. So it was not the best of times to talk about Scotland prospect to rejoin the EU. Nevertheless, we found positive responses from a number of people that we didn't expect, from different political groupings. And we are very happy that there is a contingent of MEPs that are ready to speak out for Scotland, even when Scotland is not particularly on the news and is not particularly speaking out for, the kind of political message that went to Europe after the general election. Obviously, was not one that necessarily favored independence in Europe, but nevertheless, these people exist. And I also want to mention that there is a couple of European parties that have put in their program, they approved the motions that they will support Scotland rejoining. This is the Green Party and the Party of the European Left. So I think there is still a huge degree of sympathy in Europe for Scotland, and as a campaign, we will keep working with these MEPs so that when the time comes, because we know the time will come, there's going to be an audience in the European Parliament favorable to Scottish proposition to rejoin the EU.
Well, that's good to know. I was watching a program, and we talked earlier about how poor the broadcasting is in the UK. But the program, there was a politician on the program and said, "Oh, look, it's going to be impossible for Scotland to rejoin the EU because the UK left as a unit, and if the European Union was to possibly entertain their rejoining, then it would only happen if the UK decided to rejoin. They wouldn't accept any suggestion of Scotland rejoining on its own." And I thought, that doesn't sound right to me. What's your take on that?
It's definitely not right. I mean, these 10 MEPs that signed a statement that was saying that Scotland would rejoin as an independent country. And there has been a number of statements also from national politicians, including from the Spanish government, saying that if Scotland becomes an independent country and this independence is recognized internationally, Spain will not veto Scotland rejoining the EU. And everyone is clear in Europe that if Scotland becomes a sovereign country, can apply to the EU. That's a right of every sovereign country that is in part of the European continent. And what we argue as a campaign is that Scotland should be treated with more, with a welcoming stance.
Yeah.
Not because it's a right, but because of the peculiar situation that Scotland found itself in with the Brexit problem. But definitely, from a legal standpoint, an independent Scotland can apply and can rejoin the EU. That's written in the treaties, if you want.
But the big qualifier there is that Scotland would need to be recognised by the independent state, by the world community. It would have to be recognised. By whom would it need to be recognised?
Well, I think there isn't a country in the world that wouldn't recognize Scotland. The problem we have is the UK government that doesn't want to recognize it. So I think that's the only country in the world, the only government in the world that doesn't want to recognize the right of Scotland to exist as a nation. And of course, from our perspective, this is a democratic problem that reveals the dysfunctionality of the UK constitution.
Yeah. We talked earlier about the right wing in Italy. There's also been the emergence, well, I should say the re-emergence of the far right in Germany and Austria. And in the case of Austria, the far right, I think, has now formed a government. What impact, if any, do you think that might have on any attempt made by Scotland, assuming it was independent, to rejoin the EU? With these groups, are these groups less or more sympathetic to Scotland? What do you think?
Well, I don't think these particular far-right groups that won the election in Austria and that did pretty well in regional elections in East Germany, they are quite anti-European, if you want.
Yeah.
They don't like the European Union. They tend to be pro-Putin.
Yeah.
So they are not the people you would like to talk to. At the same time, I want to make a more general point, which is the fact that the last European election, the prediction that many pundits made about the outcome was that there would be a surge of the far right across Europe. And to a large extent, that surge didn't materialize in most countries. So it was pretty limited to Germany and Austria, in fact. And it's interesting to understand and to try to understand why that is. There are many theories because if you also look at the electoral results across Germany, they are very, very different in West Germany and in East Germany.
Yeah.
And these are discussions that I had many times with the co-coordinator of the campaign of Europe Scotland, Nina Jetter, because she's from Germany and obviously the historical trajectory of West and East Germany is quite different, precisely in relation to the tragic past of the Nazi Germany, because if you allow me to talk a couple of minutes about this, I think it's quite interesting to
Please.
reflect upon it, because in West Germany there was for quite a few years after the war a process of recognizing the crimes committed by the regime, to process the guilt and the shame that were associated with the actions of Germany then. And it was something that was discussed in schools, across cultural institutions. It was part of the new Germany that emerged after the Second World War. But the same did not happen in East Germany, because in East Germany there was a dictatorship. It was a communist dictatorship, so nothing to do with Nazism. But at the same time, precisely this distance allowed people in East Germany to consider Nazism as something else, something different, something that was not something they did. But Nazism was also an experience in East Germany. And because guilt and shame were not processed in the same way, now it's possible for some of those narratives to come back. And a similar point applies actually also to Austria, because Austria was part of the Nazi regime. It was annexed by Hitler 2 years before the beginning of World War II. But then after the war, they didn't have the same processing of their own crimes like Germany did. So you have that Austria and East Germany in that are a bit similar, that there is a difficulty in processing a bit of their history. Then, of course, that's not the only element, and we must remember that the war in Ukraine keeps raging on, and there are many people that believes that the far right, both in Austria and in Germany, is strongly linked to Putin. And so their rise now is partly due to their stance on the war, which is very sympathetic to the Russian regime.
Yeah. Do you think these groups are actually financially supported by Putin?
Well, I don't know for certain, but there are people who believe so, and I can offer my Italian perspective, because Salvini is also on the far right, and is well known and proven, and there are witnesses of the fact that Salvini tried to build a bridge with the party of Vladimir Putin and try to get some money from Vladimir Putin. Now, perhaps because Salvini is not very savvy, he didn't get those money eventually, because the Russians didn't give it to them. And perhaps they were wise, because Salvini then sunk in the polls and is not very strong anymore. But definitely there was an attempt, and if Salvini tried, I think also people in the AfD might have tried.
That's a very good explanation of what happened in Germany and Austria. But what happened in Italy? How did the far right somehow attain control in Italy?
Well, I would say that it's partly due to very strong divisions in the left, because Italy, until a couple of years ago, had a number of governments which, in Italy we have the tendency to change government quite often, but there was a centrist government and a progressive government before that. And because of controversies in the last legislature, there were very acrimonious disagreements between progressive and centrist leaders.
Yeah.
And the Italian electoral system is rather complicated, but you can summarize it saying that it's a bit of a first past the post with alliances. So parties can coalesce around a single candidate. Well, the right did so, but the left and the centrists did not so. So in many situations, the vast majority of voters voted for anti-fascist and progressive and centrist parties, but the minority that voted the far right coalesced together. It's a bit as if Reform and Tories could join in each constituency to put forward a single candidate.
Yeah.
Then they would probably win in many seats. And in Italy, they did exactly that. So I wouldn't say that Italy has turned to the right. It's more like the left is too poorly organized and too divided.
Oh, by the way, I need to tell you that Mike Fennick sends his best.
Oh, so say hi to Mike. We know we're in touch with Mike, and it's always nice to hear from him.
We've had another question, a technical one. It said, when and if Scotland applies to join the EU, would Scotland be granted associate status, or can that be refused?
Why would it be refused? I mean, there are no bad feelings towards Scotland in the EU. I mean, not that I'm aware of, at least. And if that is done legally, properly, and there is no way it's going to be refused, in my view. It's a bit more complicated to rejoin the EU, obviously, because there are more requirements and there is a negotiation. But that's what we want to do as a campaign, is to ease that path. So that's precisely the point.
And I mean, it's heartening to know that you've had a sympathetic response amongst the Greens and the left, but if you had to stand back and look at the EU as a whole and give us your view of what Europe might look like in, say, 4-5 years' time, how do you see that?
So how would I see Europe in that amount of time? That's a very good question, because it's a moment of reforms, of transformation for Europe. Obviously, the international situation is terrible from all points of view. I mean, we cannot forget what's happening, the tragedy of the war in the Middle East, in Palestine, the tragedy of the war in Ukraine. And these are all situations that affect Europe very much, because they are at the border of Europe. Ukraine is a candidate country to join the EU, and our close neighbors in the Middle East, we all feel very strongly for the situation in Gaza, and now also in Lebanon, and of course also in Israel to an extent. So Europe needs to come with a number of decisions on how to deal with these situations, and these are quite important. But and it's not independent of that. There is the process of enlargement, which is starting again. The European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has told many times now that Europe needs to enlarge again. There is a number of countries that are candidates to join the EU. Ukraine is the most famous, but it's not the only ones. In the Balkans, there are other countries. And the process of enlargement goes hand in hand with a process of reform of the European democratic institution, because now it's a union of 27 countries. It might become a union of 37 countries in a few years. So there must be rules that need to be updated to make the decision-making process more flexible, and to avoid situations in which a country like Hungary can block the entire decision-making because they don't agree with something. But I think it's also an opportunity to make the European Union more democratic, to give more of a say to citizens across Europe. And there are proposals to build permanent citizens' assemblies of European citizens that can help the politicians to come up with the right decisions. And in that process, I think Scotland would fit very well, because Scotland has a incredibly rich democratic tradition, has a incredibly long European history, has an incredibly good track record on human rights, on climate change, and on a number of important issues that Europe needs to deal with in the future. And so I think that precisely at a time which Europe is looking to enlarge, Scotland needs to strongly consider whether the chance is there to rejoin as an independent country. And of course, again, we are saying this, but we don't forget that there is the UK government position that is blocking this entire conversation, because I think if the referendum that the previous Scottish government was planning to have, we will live in a different world. Scotland would be in a different position. Europe would be in a different position. And I regret that we didn't have a chance to have that decision.
It brings me to a basic question based on what we learned when we were interviewing some people recently on the show, and that is, and this may be an impossible question to answer, but I'll ask it anyway. What would the reaction be in the EU, do you think, if Scotland were to say, we cannot deal with Westminster? It is impossible. We've tried, we've asked for a referendum. They say it's not going to happen. We're not going to cooperate with you. In fact, we're going to institute policies that are regressive. And the Scottish Parliament, however unlikely it sounds right now, decided, well, we're going to have a referendum. It's consultative, but then so was Brexit. And we're planning to press ahead with that. And the outcome was that Scotland voted to leave. What do you think the reaction in the EU might be if Scotland then said, we'd like to come and talk to you about membership?
Well, it's a tricky one, right? Because if Scotland has a consultative referendum that does not have the approval of the UK government, there will be question of legitimacy that will not come just from London, but also from some people in Edinburgh, I would believe. So in that situation, I think the UK Supreme Court will be called into question probably, and the European Union will be more hesitant to say anything, either one way or the other, if there is a legal controversy ongoing. So from that standpoint, I think it's much better if it's a legal process and a constitutional one which is recognized by all parties. Now, we know there is the problem that this avenue is denied by the UK government. And I think what needs to happen, and it needs to happen as soon as the Scottish government, the Scottish people, the Scottish Parliament demands it, there must be much more international pressure on the UK government to grant a referendum, a legal constitutional referendum. Because everyone can see that the constitutional change imposed on Scotland through Brexit was not democratic, was not the way in which things should have happened. And in Europe, many people have understood that. So when there is another situation in which there is a clear demand from the Scottish people, from the Scottish Parliament, from the Scottish government, international pressure must come onto the UK government to grant it. And I think our campaign will argue very strongly for that. Now, of course, we understand that at the moment in Scotland, there are different ideas on how to move forward with the plan. There is a Scottish parliamentary election in a couple of years that probably is going to be an opportunity to discuss some of these options. So we're going to listen to what people in Scotland are going to say to decide how to argue our case in Europe. But definitely remember that a legal and constitutional way is the one for which there is going to be more support from Europe.
Mike Fenwick has been in touch and he's made this point. He's provided an extract from the Supreme Court. And that says, quotes, "The Advocate General does not dispute that the United Kingdom recognises and respects the right of self-determination in international law," close quotes. So in other words, the Attorney General might recognise self-determination everywhere in the world except here.
Yeah.
Which seems to be the position that the UK government is taking. It does beg an obvious question. I mean, for example, even if Scotland had voted yes in 2014, it would still have been within the gift of the British government to deny it access to the EU because it would have used its veto. It could have used its veto.
It could have used its veto, yes.
And that's not possible anymore because there is no veto because the UK is not there.
Yeah.
So that obstacle that might have arisen is no longer present. What is present is the authority that any referendum would have had if it did not carry some imprimatur from Westminster, which takes us into a sort of legal limbo, if you like. I mean, many countries have become independent from Westminster without a referendum. They just said, we've had enough.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is a Scottish Parliament, there is a Scottish government. These are democratic institutions. So if they have a very strong mandate, that would constitute a basis for discussion from my perspective. But once again, there is this problem that the UK Constitution is dysfunctional. You mentioned the fact that there is a recognition of international law and self-determination. Well, that might be so, but there are different rules for the different nations of the UK. So we know for a fact that in the Good Friday Agreement, Northern Ireland has the right to a referendum for the unification with Ireland. It's written in law, but that same principle does not apply to Scotland, does not apply to Wales. Then we know that there is this asymmetry in which there are devolved assemblies in Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland, but there is no English Parliament. So we know that there is the monarchy and some discussion around the legitimacy of the UK monarchy over the Kingdom of Scotland. So there is a lot of things which are not clear, they are not straightforward, they are not harmonized, and they need to be clarified. And the fact that they haven't been...
I suppose there is one big advantage here, which Scotland has, that, say, for example, I'm not sure what the case is in Italy, but certainly I know in terms of Spain, it is unconstitutional for any part of Spain to violate the integrity of the state. That's a fact. That's a constitutional fact. Because the UK Constitution is, and I'm trying to be kind here, is ramshackle. In other words, I cannot go and get a copy of the Constitution in the way I would do in France and Spain, and I suspect in Italy. It means that it's sort of half-remembered quotes from people long dead that constitute the rules. Now, it seems to me that that leaves it wide open for politicians just to get together and agree. And interestingly enough, that's exactly what happened in 2014. What happened in 2014 wouldn't have happened in other European countries, I suspect, because it would have been unconstitutional.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the UK Constitution, it's a set of rules that predates international law, predates the United Nations, predates a lot of things, and they are old, they are dysfunctional, they are ancient, they don't work anymore. And the fact that there is no understanding in the political parties in Westminster that needs to change, it's remarkable, because you already had Brexit, you already had a lot of constitutional discussions there, and the fact that there has never been a discussion after Brexit about what needs to change in terms of the constitution, it speaks volume about the refusal to deal with anything that is, one of the things I think that one of the promises that Keir Starmer threw in the bin was the commission to... he wanted to abolish the House of Lords. He kind of stepped back on that. He gave a task to Gordon Brown that was then very unhappy with what the task ended up being. It doesn't seem to me that much is going to happen there. So too little, too late, and again, not enough clarity on how Scotland can become an independent country if the people want so.
Yeah, I mean, it is terribly interesting. I asked you a question of how do you see the EU in 4 or 5 years' time? How do you see the UK in 4 or 5 years' time?
Well, not in a good position, to be honest. If the first months of a government tells you a bit about its trajectory, I would be very, very worried about the future of the UK, about a possible return of the far right, about economic decline, and this is not independent to the constitutional problem, because if you don't solve the constitutional issues, people are gonna be expressing in different ways that are not conducive to good politics, a sense that things are not quite right. I mean, the fact that the far right in the UK is called Reform tells you something about the fact that a lot of people across the political spectrum feel that something fundamental needs to change. They don't quite express it sometimes. The politicians don't quite articulate that change, but the sense that something is fundamentally wrong in the state of the UK, I think that's pretty hegemonic across the four nations.
Yeah, it is a very odd situation. I mean, I'm inclined to agree. I mean, when people lose faith in politicians and in politics, it leaves the way wide open to the far right, who will come along and say things like, "Well, we told you this. We told you couldn't trust anyone. We told you that the media are all liars. We told you that things would get worse." And that's exactly what's happened. We need somebody, a strong person in charge, to make sure that things are turned around. I can hear the words, and I'm sure you can hear them too.
Yeah, it's concerning. And again, it doesn't help that the prime minister, undermines his own narrative and his own. When politicians lie, when politicians betray promises, it doesn't work. And I mean, it's very depressing. I don't want to be to end this on a depressing note, because there is a lot of people that have very good ideas in Scotland. There is an energy, a democratic energy that can help from our perspective, the entire United Kingdom to reform, and to reform for real, not to reform the party, and to have a better relationship with Europe. So I think that we need to be able to re-energize ourselves and to build a different future. And I think Scotland is going to be a huge part of this different future, not just for Scotland, but for the UK and for Europe.
We've had people on the show since we last interviewed you, and from south of the border, and they have deplored the fact that there is no equivalent conversation in England about the place of England, English values. They've said, look, there's all this talk going on in Ireland, Wales, Scotland, discussions, debate, people energized, and they're talking about the Constitution. Who's speaking for England, they say? Who's talking about our values? Where's our parliament? These are reasonable questions, and they beg this central point, which is, why is there no such discussion? Now, people in Scotland and Wales are tempted to say, well, that's because the UK Parliament decides everything for everybody, and therefore you don't need an English Parliament. But that sounds like sophistry to me. I mean, if you've got a country, why doesn't it have its own Parliament? I mean, why use the British Parliament, which does other stuff that people in England might not regard as hugely important, because they would want to talk about their own issues and values? Do you think there's a case for an English Parliament?
Oh, absolutely. There is a case for an English Parliament. I think there is a case for a discussion about what England can be, a discussion about how to reform English democracy from the top to the bottom, I would say. And I would start from the monarchy, if you ask me. And I think, there is a number of people that have been saying these things for years, for decades, I would say. Certainly Anthony Barnett, that is a founder of our campaign. And tomorrow we have this event, which is going to be an attempt to discuss a bit this year of elections, these historic elections in the UK, this election across the European Union. We didn't talk much about that, but it was very important. And of course, the US election in a month. Everything of these elections is transformative, is historic in nature. It completely changes the political landscape, and we want to understand how that impacts Scotland in particular, in the context of this evolving relationship between the UK and the EU. And we are blessed by the fact that we're going to have two fantastic speakers, scholars, and intellectuals. Kirsty Hughes is one of the leading European leading expert on European and international politics. She has been explaining and studying how the evolving relationship between the UK and the EU can impact on Scotland's prospect to rejoin the EU. And Anthony Barnett is again a UK intellectual. He studied and campaigned for British democracy for his entire life, and he's also been studying very deeply American democracy. What's new? Where is the energy in American politics? Where is it going? And depending on what happens in November, what impact it might have on Europe, on the UK, on Scotland, on the world. So I think it's a very exciting conversation, because sometimes there are moments in which you need to listen to people that have a deep view on issues, and we feel this is precisely one of those moments in which it's time for deep reflections. So
I would agree, and I commend you for getting these two excellent speakers, and I hope people will join you tomorrow, because again, it seems to be terribly important. If you don't do this heavy lifting, it's very difficult to sort of move things forward. You have to have a strong intellectual basis and platform, and you can't do that without the preeminent thinkers participating in the process. This is very common in other parts of Europe, and it's really energizing and exciting to see it happen here. And it's a great credit to you and your colleagues for organizing this, I have to say. And I hope a lot of people will go and watch the show tomorrow. Will they be able to ask questions, or?
Absolutely, yes. We absolutely welcome questions from the public, and it's really going to be a conversation. So the more questions, the more points.
Okay. Do me a small favor. If you could ask Kirsty and Anthony if they'd like to come on the show, they'd be very welcome, because I think when you get people who think deeply about these issues, it does help to educate and inform, and it's absolutely vital, because when you look at the world situation just now, there's loads of people who are talking, but they're talking not to inform or educate, but to bias and to manipulate, and that we need to get away from that. It seems to me, and people like Kirsty and Anthony seems to me be fantastic exemplars of that. Well, we've come to the end of the time, Andrea. I must thank you very much for joining us. It's as it was last time. It was very entertaining. It was educational, and all the things that we strive for on the show. So a big thank you to you. I hope the discussion tomorrow is as successful as I hope it. I'd like to think it is. And again, I commend you for all the work that you do in Europe for Scotland, and I wish you all the very best. Take care. If you can stick around for a little bit later when we go off air, I know that Kevin would like to have a quick chat. But from me and everyone watching tonight, a big thank you, and have a great meeting tomorrow night. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night.